Okay, so we're going to get started today, and we're going to continue working with complex surfaces. So last time we were in Rhino, remember we took a break and dealt with some V-Ray stuff. Now we're back into Rhino. The last time you guys worked in Rhino, we built those pillows and whatever, and we worked with curved networks to create complex surfaces. We're going to do something very similar, but on a larger scale. So we're going to deal with some topography today, and I think that's a good way to learn how to manipulate and work with complex surfaces. We'll spend the next three lectures dealing exclusively with this piece of terrain. Next class, you will get your assignment 202 handout. So you get the weekend off with no assignments hanging over your head. That's a good thing. But you'll get your 202, and then we will actually spend, exercise 212 and 213 working on getting ready for that assignment 202. So you can do a lot of the work in class. It will help walk you through a lot of the steps. So this one will be a physical model. So we'll do a digital model, and then you'll create the pieces to be able to go laser cut it and glue it together. So I'll walk you through all of that. Today's kind of the precursor for it, getting ready, getting our feet wet, and practicing. The nature of the next three lectures is there's a lot of repetition. I will go slower in the beginning, and then I'll speed up and then cover new stuff, and then I'll speed everything up and cover even more new stuff as we go forward. So you'll get some repetition, but it seems to work nicely in terms of teaching people how to do this part of the process. So the first thing that we need is we need some kind of a source of the terrain information to begin with. You could have terrain information coming from a surveyor or from some model that pre-exists that was given to you as part of your design process. For our purposes, we're going to pick a piece of terrain and use the SketchUp Geolocation feature to get that piece of terrain. It's not the most accurate piece of terrain in the world, but it is a place to start, and it's something that everybody can pick from. So that tends to be a good thing. So as much as SketchUp is not my best friend, though I do have to teach it, so I have to be somewhat friends with it, today we're going to get into SketchUp just a little bit. So if you've never touched SketchUp, it's not the end of the world, but we need to get our terrain information from SketchUp. So I've gone ahead and I've opened up the SketchUp 2019 on this computer. I'm going to pick the architectural template in inches. Make sure you are in inches because it's going to throw everything off if we're not in inches. When SketchUp opens, I can go ahead and I can delete the little person that automatically comes in. We don't need him whatsoever. Then I'm going to go to the File menu and go to Geolocation, Add Location. So it's File, Geolocation, Add Location. And I can then go and look for, it'll bring up, there we go, there we are. You'll bring up some location. You can pick any location for this that you want. I would encourage it to be something that has some hills and some terrain to it. If you pick something that's really flat, you're not going to get a lot out of the exercise. So pick something that has some terrain to it. I would not pick something like Half Dome at Yosemite where you have a vertical cliff. That's going to be really hard to build. So we want somewhere kind of in the middle ground, something that's reasonably mountainous but not overly steep. And so I think for me, I'm just going to pick a spot near Lake Tahoe. Something like that should work just fine. We'll zoom in here. Let's go more like right about there. That should be kind of entertaining. When you zoom in, you'll notice that at a certain level, you'll get a white square that will show up. That white square is the maximum amount of information that you can grab from SketchUp at a time. So as you start to zoom in, you can zoom in further and the white square goes away. We're looking for a fair amount of good information, so having the white square, that's about the maximum information we can get. Once you have that and you've picked something, go ahead and click on the Select Region, and it'll give you the little selection. And then you can click the Import button. And this has actually changed a little bit in this version of SketchUp. The 2019 is a little different than previous versions. The button used to say Grab, and so now it's Import. And it will bring in a file for you. It looks like just a flat plane with a photograph on it. However, if we go to the File menu and we go to Geolocation and we go to Show Terrain, we can look at what this piece of terrain looks like. So there's my piece of terrain. That looks reasonable. If you end up picking a piece of terrain, you get it afterwards and you say, I don't really like that very much, just create a brand new SketchUp file, go back in, and do a new piece of terrain. SketchUp doesn't like it when you go back and try to grab it again once you've already brought terrain in once, especially if they're far apart. It gets cranky about it. So better to just create a brand new SketchUp file and bring it in that way. So now that I have my piece of terrain that I'm going to work with, I'm going to go back up to the File menu here, and I'll go to Save. And I need to save this into my folder for today. And let's see, where are we? We're in 211. There we go. And on the handout, it says to save as SketchUp 7. We updated Rhino. Yay! So we don't have to save the SketchUp 7 anymore. Actually, we don't even have to back save at all. We can save it as the 2019 version, and it'll come in just fine. So that's great. We'll just click on the Save button. No back saving required. Perfect. Now we'll go ahead and open up Rhino. All right, so we're going to try this whole thing again. As of this moment, my computer appears to be working. Hopefully yours is too. If it's not, try restarting it again and see if you can get the network back that way. I don't know, fingers crossed that we can make it work. I apologize for the delay, but hopefully you guys enjoyed your little break there without it. So I already created the SketchUp file, and I already exported the SketchUp file. Now it's a matter of jumping back over into Rhino. This was the part that I couldn't do because I couldn't open Rhino. So we're going to pick up right there where we left off. So the first thing I need to do is I need to bring in this piece of terrain into SketchUp. And so we've done block references, bringing it in, but this time I really want to import the full piece of terrain. I want it all in my Rhino file so I can start to work on it. So I'm going to go to File and then Import, not Insert. So it's File, Import. I'm going to look for the SketchUp file that I saved. And I'll go ahead and click on Open. This brings up the SketchUp Import Options dialog box. We want to leave it as a mesh for right now. We're going to convert it over into a NURB surface in a little bit, but we'll leave it as a mesh when we want to join together the edges and the faces. So all of that's good. We'll go ahead and say OK. So I haven't changed any options. We'll go ahead and say OK. And it will then bring in the terrain. And if I zoom out here, we'll see a preview of that piece of terrain. Now this is a triangulated mesh. So if we look at this not in the wireframe mode, but if we look at it in the shaded mode, if you look carefully at these edges, it's actually little flat triangle facets. And so there's nothing wrong with those flat triangular facets, but it's not exactly a smooth surface either. It's also what is called a mesh. Rhino is built to run on a mathematical definition of a surface, so it's an infinitely smooth surface. This is made up of those little triangles. So as you zoom in, you're going to be stuck with those flat faces, and you're not going to have nearly the flexibility or the smoothness of a traditional NURBS surface. So we're going to convert this triangular mesh into a NURBS surface. And there are multiple ways of doing it. Some are a little bit easier than the way that I'm going to suggest that we do it, but the end result is not nearly as flexible as the way I'm going to do it. So a large part of today is practicing with curved networks and developing this surface and being able to convert this mesh into an actual nice NURBS surface. So I'm going to look first at the layers that came in with my SketchUp file. So I'm going to click on the Layers dialog box here. It came in with a couple different layers. The first one here is what they call Location Snapshot. A sublayer of that is what they call Layer 0. And then there's this other layer that has absolutely nothing on it. So none of that is particularly helpful. So let me go ahead and restructure everything. First thing I'll do is I'll take this Layer 5 here. I'm going to double click it, and I'm going to call that layer SketchUp. Like that. Then I'll create a sublayer for SketchUp, and this one is going to be the mesh. I could call it like SK for SketchUp-mesh, if that helps keep things a little bit more organized. Make it a little bigger so you can see it here. I'm also going to create a sublayer here for SK, and I'll call it plane. What that is just this flat plane here. I could just delete it if I want to, but I'd rather keep both pieces. So let me select the flat plane, and I'm going to change object layer. So I'll right click and select change object layer. Then I can turn that one off. Sorry, wrong one. And then I'll select the mesh and also put it on the SK mesh layer. So change object layer, and now that's on the mesh layer itself. At this point, I can go ahead and delete all the rest of the layers that came in with SketchUp. So we'll just click on delete. If yours don't delete, it's possible that you didn't delete the little person. If you didn't delete the little person, you have to go find that person, delete them. It also might be that the person is a block reference, so you have to delete the block reference to delete the layers. It's not the end of the world if the layers stick around for right now. Ultimately, you'd want to delete them for a cleanliness factor. So now I have this mesh that we've been working with. And so what I want to do is I want to convert that mesh into a NURBS surface. So a couple things that I want to point out is, number one, there is an option to take this mesh as it is and convert it straight to a NURBS surface. It's going to maintain the triangular facets when I do this. So when I do that, it's a command called mesh to NURBS, and it's available under the surface menu, I think. I always type it in. There we go. Never mind. It's under the mesh menu. It's from, no, wait. I don't know. I'm not sure where it is in the menu structure. But if you type in mesh to NURB, it'll initiate this command. It says select polygon meshes to convert to NURBS. There's the mesh. I want to convert it to a NURB. It does the conversion for me. But the result, I'm going to move this off so you can see one versus the other. This was my mesh. This is now my poly surface, which retains the facets. So I retain all of those little triangles. So I haven't been able to make this any smoother. But technically, this is now a NURBS poly surface, not a mesh. Okay? So to me, this doesn't really get us anywhere. It's easy, but it doesn't get us anywhere. So instead, we're going to divide up this mesh into a bunch of parallel lines. And we're going to work with those parallel lines. So I'm going to, over here in my layers here, I'm going to take layer 1 and I'm going to rename it to be contour X. I will take layer 2 and rename that to be contour Y. Now, with contour X as my active layer, so I'll double click on it to make it active, I'm going to take this surface here and I'm going to perform a contour command on it. So I'll go up to curve, curve from objects, contour. Alternatively, I could just type in contour into the command line. It'll ask me to select the objects for contours. So I'm going to select that mesh right here, and I'll press enter. Next, it says contour plane base point. So this is where do I want to start the contour. So I want to snap right to this corner. But notice, because it's a mesh, I can't snap to it. So I need to turn on over here in my object snaps, like end snap, for example, won't work. So if I come over here, if I choose vertex or not, those will both snap. Vertex is probably the best one, so I'll leave that one checked, and I'll use a vertex snap to that corner right there. It doesn't matter which corner you pick, just one of the corners. Then it says direction perpendicular to the contour planes. So all of the contours that I'm going to be creating here are contour X's. So I'm going to go along the Y direction. Now, if you mess this up and you flip X and Y, it doesn't make any difference. You're going to end up doing the same thing. But when I choose this, I'm not going to snap to the other corner. I'm going to turn on my ortho or hold down shift, and I'm going to go way off in space here such that it's a perfectly flat line along that X axis or along that Y axis, depending on which axis I'm on. So I'll click there like that. Next thing it asks is the distance between the contours. I'm going to do those distances at about 100 feet. So I'll type 100 followed by an apostrophe. Don't mistake this for inches. If you do it in inches, your lines will be way too close together. So we need it at about 100 feet. It's possible to do it at 50 feet. 100 feet seems about right. So I'll go ahead and press enter, and you'll see that it will create a bunch of contours going across my surface there. You guys see those all selected? We don't need the contours to be any closer than what my triangular facets are. So at 100 feet, I'm a little bit closer together than my triangular facets, but not by too much. If I did this even closer, if I did it every 50 feet, it's too many lines, and I'm not getting any more information out of doing it. So we're looking for an approximate value there. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move down to the contour Y layer. So I've made that active. I'm going to deselect everything and then perform a new contour. So I'll go to Curve, Curve from Objects, Contour. I'll select my surface again. I'll press Enter. I'll start at the same corner, but this time I'm going to go off in the X direction here. And again, not snapping to any object, just straight out in an orthographic with ortho turned on. I will click. My distance will be the same at 100 feet, and I'll press Enter, and it will then divide up the surface in the opposite direction. So if I were to turn off the SketchUp surface as a whole, you'd see that I'd end up with this kind of grid pattern on the ground. I don't have my OpenGL turned off, so let me fix that really quick. Tools, and then Options, View, OpenGL. Let me turn off that tessellation so you can see it. There we go. That's better. So I'm seeing this grid. Now if I look at this grid in the top view, it should look like a perfect grid. None of my lines should be on a diagonal. I should just see straight lines in both directions. If you're seeing part of your topography, you didn't do the contour correct. The other place where mistakes have a tendency to happen is that when you go to do the contour, let me turn off the contour Y and repeat that one here for a second. You don't deselect everything before you perform the contour. You leave all of those lines that you created in contour X selected, not the surface, and you go back to perform the contour. So I'd go to Surface, Curve, Curve from Objects, Contour. And my contour base point would be the same, my direction would be the same, and yes, go ahead and do it, and I end up not with lines but a bunch of dots. So that's a problem. I don't want those dots. If you contour a surface, you get a line. If you contour a line, you get a point. Does that make sense as I divide it up? So we don't want all of these dots. If you get the dots, that's a mistake because you had lines selected, not your surface itself. So I do have both Contour X and Contour Y available. I'm going to turn off the SketchUp layer so that I'm left with just these curves. And with those curves selected, I'm going to move over into the top view, and I'm going to clean up the edges of the curves. So if you look at the edge here, that edge, for example, that line goes all the way through, but there's all these ragged ends going off. I want to take the lines that are closest to the edge. So we'll say that one, this one, and this, oops, that one there. And I will use those to trim all of these ragged edges all the way around. So I'll go ahead and type in the trim command. Those are my cutting objects. And I will select through all of those lines. So we'll do the same thing all the way around. And when I'm done, we should end up with a perfect grid that's completely contained by the outermost pieces. Now see how there's a few little pieces that hang over? I need to make sure that that doesn't happen. So we'll go ahead and go back to trim, if I can type, and we'll get rid of those 3 little pieces right there. If there are any other pieces, so it helps to kind of look in carefully at each of the corners, making sure that there's no little ragged edges that I missed. Good. There's none that I missed. So at this point, if I go back into the perspective view, I see a perfectly contained little mesh of lines, or a little nest of lines, and I'm going to create a surface from that network of lines. So we'll get there in just a second, but before, this is a perfect opportunity to save your work, because sometimes during that creation, you end up crashing. So I'm going to go ahead and save this real quick. I'll go to File and then Save. There we go. That way I can come back to it if I want to. And I'm going to make sure that I'm on a new layer. So I'm on layer 3 right now. That's current. There's no objects on layer 3. It's time to make a surface out of this network of curves. So I'm going to use the curve network command. It's available under the surface curve network. It's a weird command because if you type it into the command line, it's actually network srf is the command. But if you get it from the menu structure, it's called the curve network. Such is life. So I'll go ahead and click on curve network here. And you can see there's the command network srf. Select the curves in the network. So I'm going to select all of these curves like that. I'll press enter. It usually throws this error saying you have more than 100 curves. It's okay. Go ahead and say, yes, I want to continue. And if I set this up correctly, I will end up with a little preview that shows 4 distinct sides, A, B, C, and D. This is a good sign because it was able to sort the curves in both directions. If something went wrong, or one of those curves had a ragged edge that wasn't completely contained by the outside curves, it would throw up an error saying, unable to sort curves. Would you like to sort curves manually? Generally, that means there's a problem. So stop and figure out what the problem was. Don't manually put in the curves. Let's see, what else can happen? Sometimes, whoops, I must have gone ahead and pressed enter or somehow. Sometimes, what else can happen? Sometimes it'll say, we sorted the curves, but there was a problem with a few curves. Would you like me to show the selected curves? In that scenario, say yes, and that way you can look at which ones have a problem. Now, that brings up the surface from curve network dialog box here. With our tolerances, this is how closely we follow the existing curves. The default options here are fine. If you find that your curve network crashes when you try to create it, you can chop out a 0 in here, and it will be less accurate, but it may allow you to actually finish the curve network. I'm going to go ahead and say OK. This process can take 3 to 5 minutes, so you have to be a little bit patient when it creates it. And when it's done, it's going to create a nice solid black object, and it's also going to dramatically slow down the computer. So I will teach you how to fix that after we get it made. So we'll let it work. I'm going to pause the recording while this happens because you don't need to listen to 3 minutes of nothing. And then we'll start up again once it's done. OK, so mine just finished. There it is. It's a really solid block. Yours might be blue, it might be black, it's whatever color the layer is. So my layer is blue, therefore it's showing up as blue. Now, the first thing that I'll do, instead of trying to work with it at all, I'm just going to single click on that blue shape. And when I single click on it, that blue shape, after a little bit of time, is going to turn solid yellow. There it is. If you have all 4 viewports showing, it's going to take longer to select the object because this is a really dense object. At this point, with it selected in yellow, I'm going to type the rebuild command and press enter. And this brings up the rebuild surface dialog box. So right here under our point count, we're going to rebuild this not at 10 by 10. That's going to be too smooth for our purposes. We're going to start at a value that's about 200 by 200. So I'll type 200 and then 200. And once I have that set, I'll go ahead and say OK. And this will immediately allow me to work with my file. So what was really slow is now rebuilt, and now I can work with it. I'll turn off the contour X and contour Y and let you guys take a look at this. And given that it's blue, let me switch it over into something that you can see a little bit easier on the screen. Now, if I look at this, like on this hill, for example, you can see that it did smooth out some of those triangles a little bit, but we can still kind of see those triangles. True? So when I see those a little bit, I can choose to smooth this out a little bit more. Now, each time I smooth it, we lose a little bit of the terrain information. So it becomes a little bit more smooth. And I could actually layer it up with my original SketchUp file so you can see how accurate it is against the original SketchUp file versus the new. So as I zoom in here, you can see that there's little bits that have been lost as it's smoothed out. Mostly the peaks of these little triangles. Okay, so let me turn off SketchUp. I'm going to rename this layer 3 to be 200 to represent the rebuild by 200. And for illustration purposes, I'm going to take this and I'm going to copy it onto another layer, and I'm going to rebuild it by 100 so you can see how much smoother it gets as I go through. So it's not something that you need to do. You'll decide which level and just do it once. But I want to point it out for you. So there's my first one. I'm going to create another layer here. We'll call this one 100. I'm going to take my surface. I'm going to copy it in place. And I'm going to move it onto that 100 layer. There it is. Then I will take it and I will rebuild it. Instead of 200 by 200 at 100 by 100. And when I do that, I have two now on top of each other. Let me change the color of this one a bit so you can see, as they overlay each other, how the new surface that I created, the orange one, is smoothing out what was in the gray surface before. If I turn off the 200 and we look at those ridges that we were doing, you guys should be able to see this okay still on the screen. Let me change it back to, some of the black usually just shows it better on the screen. You can see that those little, like that little ridge that goes along here, it's gotten a lot smoother. Right up here at the top, that's starting to get a lot smoother. So that value might be a pretty good approximation of a nice smooth set of terrain. So that might be the right amount of rebuild. I could take it further, so I could create another layer. We'll call this one 50, for example. I could take this surface, copy, in place. Let's move it on to the 50 layer. And I could then rebuild that one to be at 50 by 50.
Is there any difference from rebuilding from the previous one or rebuilding it from the beginning?
No, no, you'll get to the same place. So now, if we were to look at those edges, you can see that it's really starting to smooth those out. So we're not seeing any of those facets anymore. But at the same time, if you compare it to the 200, let me change the 200 to a different color so you can see it better. You can see that we're dramatically changing the contour by a fair amount. So this ridge right in here has gotten a lot smoother. The gray is the new rebuild. The orange is what was here before. And we've kind of chopped off all that orange and smoothed it out. So at this level, it might be too smooth for your liking. But again, it becomes a personal preference. You know, at what amount is the right amount of smoothing, so to speak. We could take it even further. So let me create one more layer here. We'll call this one 10. I'm going to copy this in place, and we'll move it onto the 10 layer here. And then we can rebuild it at 10 by 10. And so here we can really start to see how it's smoothed things out. So we're losing a bunch of that valley in here. But at the same time, this is a very smooth end file. Right? There's no facets to it at all. So in my opinion, 10 is too much. We get too much. 200 is probably too little by comparison. But somewhere in the neighborhood of 100, that one's looking pretty good. You could try 150 if you wanted to. But it's, again, it's a fine line of how much detail do you want to retain versus how much of the, let me move to this one, right? How much of these little facets do you want to keep? So how much smoothing do you want to do? So I think 100 is about right. So I'm going to stick with that one as the surface that I'm going to work with going forward. Okay? So I've got my piece of terrain now. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take this piece of terrain and we're going to create a bunch of contour lines from it, or topo lines. So you guys have looked at maps before, and you see that maps have topo lines on them that are relative to certain elevations. We can do the same thing out of this new surface. So I'm going to create a new layer. Actually, I can use layer 4 here for it, and I will call this topo lines. And I'll make that the active layer. And I'm going to contour this surface yet one more time. So I'll go up to my curve, curve from objects, and then contour. This time I'm not picking the SketchUp, I'm picking my nice rebuilt surface that I just created. I'll press enter. It asks me to select the base point. I'll select that corner again. But this time I'm not going in the X direction, or in this case it would be the Y direction. I'm not going in the X direction. I want to go straight up in the Z direction. So I'll do it by switching my views so that I'm looking at it either in the front view or the right side view. And I'll make sure that I'm going straight up and down. There it is, going straight up and down. So that's in the Z direction this time. And then I need to specify what's the distance between these contours. So this is a little bit more arbitrary. I'm going to go ahead and set it at 10. So this will be every 10 feet I'll have a contour going vertically. So we'll set it at 10 feet. I'm making sure I use that apostrophe for my foot lines. And then we can go ahead and build out as if it were like a map. It's an oddly satisfying thing to watch. And so that then builds out all of these contours at 10-foot intervals. If I look at those contours in the side view, they should be perfectly horizontal. So they shouldn't be tipped at all. They should be perfectly horizontal. That's a sign that I did them correctly. Okay, so now I have all of those contours created. There's one last thing that I'll do, and that is that I have my topo lines that are three-dimensional. They're standing up, they're every 10 feet. But what if I wanted to create an actual flat map, where I wanted to go laser cut it or something like that? I could take this one step further and create a new layer called Topo Lines Flat. I'll make that the active layer. I will create a plane rectangular plane larger than all of those topo lines. And then in the top view here, I'm going to do a project command. You guys have all done project so far, so we're bringing back the idea of a project command. I have all of the lines selected. I will go up to, what is it? Curve from objects, project. Select surfaces to project onto. I'll select that surface, and I'll go ahead and press enter. Notice I'm doing all of that from within the top view, so I'm looking straight down at the object. And it has then created, if I were to turn off everything and delete that rectangle, it's created a flat topographic map based on that terrain that I just created. Does that make sense for how I created it? So these are the basic steps that we're going through to ultimately create something like this. There's obviously a lot more steps, and we're going to have a lot more fine-tuning to go, but this is our preliminary kind of introduction to this idea. Okay? I think on here I might talk about making this a flat topo set an AutoCAD file. You don't need to make it an AutoCAD file. We'll get to that later on. So you don't need to worry about that. So what I'm looking for today is for you guys to get all the way through this terrain to where you could create a flat piece of topo, or topo lines. And you could go ahead and post that as a screenshot. Because the computers were kind of being funky, I will let you out of the last part about creating a little meditation pavilion and doing some renderings or whatever. You don't have to worry about any of that. So just get to the point where we have this flat topo line, do a screen capture of it, either by using the screen capture tool or click the down arrow and go to capture to file. That'll create a JPEG of what you see on the screen, and then you'll go ahead and post that so that I can see that as proof of where you went. Okay? Next class we'll go through all of the same stuff again. So if you feel like you got a little lost, don't worry, we're going through it again. And actually on Wednesday of next week, I'll start from the very beginning all the way back in SketchUp and do the whole thing through again. So I repeat myself a lot to make sure it really sinks in for you guys. Okay? So I'll let you guys start to work. I apologize that we had computer issues, and I'll come around and help you in just a second.